All right, today is July 21st, 2022. My name is Rose Hurwitz, and I am interviewing Carole Wolanow today. Hi, Carole, how's it going?
Terrific.
Good. I'd like to start by talking about the tornado that hit Dallas in October 2019. Can you tell me a bit about your experience in that tornado?
Yes, I can. Actually, my husband and I were not in town. We were not even in the country. We were in Uzbekistan.
Okay.
And we found out about it through social media. We had a house sitter who was with our dog, and we found out about it through our grandson, who was living in a condominium right around the corner here from the JCC. He actually went over to our home. It's only 2 blocks away, but it took him 45 minutes to get there because of all the downed trees. So he went over to our home. He found that there was no significant damage. We only had a little bit of just a little bit of a damage on our roof. And thank God we had very, very conscientious neighbors who put a tarp over it. We found that our dog sitter and our dog had gone into an inside closet, and they were safe. But many of our neighbors, many of our very close neighbors, in fact, one of whom, a close family friend who lived at the end of the street, totally lost their home. Many of the neighbors in the neighborhood had significant damage and lost their homes. So when we got back 2 weeks later, or 3 weeks later, we came into a neighborhood that actually looked like a war zone. It was something we had never experienced in our lives. It was devastating. The only thing that we had experienced that even came close to it was 6 months prior to that, when we had a very, very significant storm, which was a mini tornado that came through exactly the same streets, Kern and North Haven. And the odd thing about that was that it came down the same streets, but it came down in such a way that all the trees fell into the street rather than onto the homes. It was a miracle, because with very minor exception, none of the homes were damaged, and it was on a Sunday. And so we were all home, and we were all out on the street in the afternoon, clearing out all these very large trees. We had very large oak trees and trees that had been there for, some of them were over 100 years old. We were clearing out all the trees so that we could have the cars pass, by the next day. And it was a big neighborhood effort, and we were able to get most of the trees cleared so that we could get the telephone company to get access to the lines. And that was just 6 months prior to this major hurricane that happened with the hurricane, I guess it was not the hurricane, but the tornado that was 6 months following that. So that didn't have as much damage as the one that happened then 6 months later, when the neighborhood took such a hit. Wow. And my grandson was living in one of the condominiums on Valleydale, and that's part of a homeowners association, and we own the condominium. And that condominium complex actually lost three buildings. 3 buildings were totally damaged and completely wiped out, and the condominium association is still in the process of trying to get those 3 buildings rebuilt. So, and my friends at the end of the block are still negotiating with the insurance company. But
wow.
The community has completely changed, because what used to be homes that were built in the 50s are now these very modern white structures that are 2-story and modern, or they're what we used to call mini mansions when we first started having homes being torn down in the neighborhood and made into mini mansions. So there's been a big change in the look of the neighborhood. The original change was done intentionally when people were buying homes and rebuilding, and the secondary change has been as a result of the tornado. So, like I said, we weren't here for the initial hit, but we've seen the aftermath
Yeah.
and the change in the community as a result of that.
Is it the same occupants that are changing to these more modern homes, or is it a changeover of ownership?
Well, in some cases, it's the same occupants, and in some cases, people sold the land and it's new ownership.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you notice at all if the mini tornado caused the neighborhood to be more aware of tornado activity or change their preparedness behaviors at all?
The mini tornado changed our preparedness. Most of us went into this mode of stockpiling goods, and as if we were Mormons, actually. We were stockpiling goods and things in our homes to be prepared for disaster. And we did do that. Our neighbors across the street actually have a real 1960s storm cellar on their property, but they have a what used to be an old farm, and I think in the 1940s the grandfather built a tornado shelter, and we've actually used that in the past.
Really?
Yeah, but they're the only ones in the neighborhood that have that. But many of us went out and bought large amounts of goods to store up in case of disaster.
What did you notice about relationships among neighbors changing? Did people become more connected to each other or more reliant on people outside of the community?
No,
for
people
help?
became more reliant upon each other.
Okay.
And more connected among each other. In fact, one story that's very personal is that one of my neighbors down the street, let me just put it this way, we had a mailman that we'd had for like 20 years, and he was very close to all of our neighbors, and he used to put treats down the slot for the dogs and all that. And he and I both became aware that this neighbor was, she wasn't bringing in her mail and all of that, and she was not responding. And so I knocked on her door, and first I got a response that she was okay. And then after a while, she wasn't being responsive. And one day, there was a fire truck down the street that was doing a wellness check on another neighbor of ours that we knew had potentially become senile. And so I asked them to please do a wellness check on this other woman. And at first they weren't wanting to do it because no one had called them in. But the mailman and I kind of persisted. And finally they went over there, and they actually had to break into her home, and they found her pretty much non-responsive in her home. And they took her to the hospital. And I think had we not been persistent and had not been observant of what was going on in the neighborhood, she may have died. So I think the neighborhood became more aware of other people and more conscious of what was going on among ourselves, and more aware of what was going on with other people. And this was all during a time of COVID, you know, when people may have tended to be more reclusive, but we weren't.
Did you and your neighbors meet in person very much during pandemic lockdowns?
Well, there
or
was
it
one neighbor
mostly
across
just
the
phone
street
calls?
where we kind of formed a two-family bubble. And so we kind of decided that between the two of us, we would be very, very cautious about who we interacted with so that we could have a two-family bubble. And that was helpful from a social standpoint.
Is there a large Jewish population in your neighborhood or your street?
Yes, actually on my street alone, there are 5 Jewish families.
Okay. Does that contribute to your resiliency at all, or how you engage with disasters or traumatic events?
Not particularly. We're the only couple on our street that's modern Orthodox. The rest of them are either Reform or non-observant. But it's comforting to know that the Jews are moving back into the neighborhood. In fact, some of the young couples that are moving onto the street are young Jews with families. And our neighborhood used to be very, very Jewish. In fact, there used to be a lot of observant Jews in the neighborhood, and those people, when their children grew up, they either moved out or their kids moved out and moved elsewhere. Some of them moved actually into the Eruv, and for a while there were less Jews in the neighborhood, and now they're becoming more Jews, but they're less observant because they're not able to walk up to Churchill Way. But it's becoming it's turning again, and I don't know. Maybe it's because the homes in our neighborhood are more affordable than up towards Churchill Way, although we're not in an affordable neighborhood by any means. I mean, this neighborhood here down by the J is not an affordable neighborhood, but it is nice to know that when we see a new home going up, we find out who it is, and it's a young doctor and his wife with a couple of kids, and they're Jewish. Yay!
How would you say the Jewish community is involved in disaster recovery for either the tornado or COVID or the freeze in 2021?
Well, JFS was very involved through the food pantry. So, and I've gotten re-involved with volunteering at the food pantry. So they were always very involved. And during the disasters, they were very involved with getting goods out to the families.
And what is your involvement with the food pantry?
I'm mostly helping the shoppers, but I also do intake and helping stock the shelves.
Has community service always been an important part of Jewish community for you?
Yes, in different ways. I mean, when I was a full-time worker, when I worked full-time, I was mostly involved on a different level, like on serving on boards of directors and things like that, things I could do in the evening. But now that I'm retired, I have more time during the day, so I can do things on a more voluntary level that involve daytime hours.
Mm-hmm. And I'd love to hear your experience in contributing to recovery for disasters outside of Dallas. You mentioned there was a Hurricane Rita experience that you had.
Yes, actually, right after Hurricane Rita, there was a threat of another hurricane that was going to come like immediately thereafter. And we were very active in ZOA at the time, and we got an email from their office here in Dallas asking if we were available to house part of the staff of the Israeli consulate in Houston. And we said absolutely. So it was an amazing experience because it formed a lifetime relationship with a woman who is fantastic. So we housed Belena Savadia, her husband Sir Colum, and their daughter Lee. She was the assistant general counsel for the Houston office. She came to my home and she stayed for 5 days. The general counsel, his security staff, and their dog went to a friend of mine just 4 or 5 miles away. So between our two households, we ran the council was being run between the two, and we would take them back and forth. So Melanish and I became like sisters. I mean, we just absolutely bonded. And from that day forward, whenever she would come to Dallas, she always stayed with me. She never stayed in a hotel again. We became extremely close friends. And for the rest of the time that she was in Houston, we were just, like I said, extremely close. And she was getting ready to leave Houston, and she was pregnant, and she delivered twin boys. But they were preemies. And there's a doctor who is attached to the foreign ministry who is in charge of the health of all of the foreign service workers who through the ministry of foreign service. And he actually happens to be the husband of some very good friends. He and his wife are very good close friends of my sister-in-law and brother-in-law, so I've known them for 20 years. So anyway, his name is Michael. He said to Belinish, he said, "Your babies are too fragile to travel. You have to stay another 6 months in Houston," which she had not planned to do.
Mm-hmm.
So because she stayed another 6 months in Houston, when my husband and I were taking our grandchildren on a cruise, we went through Houston and we visited them and we saw the babies. And then we've seen them several times again on our trips to Israel, and we saw them just this last April when we were in Israel. We saw the boys, who are now 14.
Oh, wow.
So we have this very close relationship with her, and I feel like she's my sister. And it built a bond that will be a lifetime bond. And as a matter of fact, we joked years and years ago, we joked about I said, one of these days you're going to become the Israeli ambassador to Ethiopia. She says, "Oh no, that's an political appointed position, it'll never happen." Well, guess what? They did a political appointment of a man who turned out to be not so great. They turned around and they appointed her. She became the Israeli ambassador to Ethiopia.
Wow.
And she was there for several years and then became the Israeli ambassador to Rwanda. And as a matter of fact, she was the first person of Ethiopian descent who became a member of the foreign ministry in Israel. So she's a very important person.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so glad that I had the opportunity to claim her as a friend and a sister. Mm-hmm. And it was because of this hurricane business after Rita, mm-hmm. and her coming to stay in my home. So,
wow.
I mean, what can I say? Disaster brings friendship, brings sisterhood.
Yeah.
So that's what happened with that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Did her home sustain any damage in Rita? Do you know?
Well, she was in an apartment. I don't think so.
Okay.
No.
Good. Was she involved in any of the community recovery in Houston once she returned?
I really don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. She went back to her job and
yeah.
Yeah.
Good. I'm glad.
Yeah.
There wasn't any damage for her, and you all were able to make that connection.
That's
so
connection
cool.
was the connection was a life-changing one.
Yeah.
And it was because of her and also Dr. Rick Hodes, who do you know about him? Mm-hmm. Well, he's a doctor, an Orthodox Jewish doctor who works in Ethiopia with children, and he works through the Joint. And also a book that we read, it was because of the three of them that my husband and I made a trip to Ethiopia. And we met with Rick, and we saw the work that he does, and we learned to love the country. Mm-hmm. So all these things come together, and it makes for life-changing opportunities.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah.
What other efforts are you aware of that the Dallas Jewish community has made to help other impacted communities outside of Dallas?
In what ways?
For instance, other hurricanes in Houston or some wildfires, just anything that...
Well, I know that when there have been disasters, there have been, one of the catering companies has sent a truck with food down to Houston.
Okay.
I'm not aware of all the details, but I know that that has happened.
Great. How has your experience with these recovery efforts changed your perspective or behaviors of when you hear about these events on the news, either close to home or far away?
Well, when it's close to home, it wants me to get in my car and immediately go do something. When it's far away, I wish that I could get more involved. It makes me wish that I was young enough to just put on a backpack and go. But at my age, I realize that's not an opportunity for me right now. But I wish I could.
What other parts of your experience, either with the 2019 tornado or the 2021 freeze, would you like to discuss today?
Well, with the freeze, that was an interesting one. We had gas, but we had no electricity.
Oh, no.
So with the gas, we were able to use our stovetop, and we were able to sleep in front of our fireplace.
Good.
But it encouraged us to get a generator. So actually, just in the last few months, we've installed a generator in our home. And I don't think, even with this heat wave, it's had to go on yet. But I will not be surprised if the grid goes down and our generator goes on.
Mm-hmm.
But we're prepared for it now.
Good.
I feel like we're prepared for either it to go on if there's a heat-related disaster, or if in the winter there's a freeze-related disaster. I feel more comfortable.
Do you remember how many days you were without power after the
Yes,
freeze?
we were without power for 5 days.
Wow.
But I did not feel stressed by it because I knew I could put on a lot of clothes, that I was not going to freeze to death.
Mm-hmm.
I knew I was losing food in my freezer, but it wasn't a big deal. I kept my refrigerator closed as much as possible, took out only what I needed. And sitting by the fireplace was warm and cozy, and I could read during the day, and I didn't feel stressed. I wasn't stressed, which
Good.
was a good thing, yeah. I felt terrible for the people who had large families and may not have had fireplaces, and who were bundled up and trying to keep their kids warm and occupied, because that was a very big stressor for large families with kids who couldn't keep them warm, couldn't feed them. I mean, that was a stressor for me. But for me personally, I was comfortable enough to get through it.
Good. Do you remember how businesses in the neighborhood, either Jewish owned or not, were impacted by the tornado or the freeze, if at all?
Yes, well, our own business, which was a laundromat during South Dallas, down in South Dallas, was totally closed down.
For both events?
For the, well, not for the tornado, because
Okay.
the tornado was not in that neighborhood, but for the freeze. For the
Okay.
freeze, it was totally shut down.
Wow. How many days did y'all have to close?
Well, I think about 5,
Okay.
yeah.
Were you able to get to the business, or what was the street quality like?
No, we were not
during
able
that
to
time?
leave our home, so it was just totally closed.
Really?
Yeah.
Was it due to
It was closed.
power
due-
outage with the
due to power
stoplights,
outage.
or?
Due-
Okay.
Due to power outage and ice on the roads. I mean,
Mm.
the power outage was one thing, but also we were not in any way wanting any of our employees to risk their lives trying to travel there, or the customers to even try, so, and we just closed it.
Okay.
But with the power outage, closed it anyway.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember how long there was ice on the streets and what attempts were made to clear the ice?
Well, there were very little attempts made to clear the ice, and I don't think my husband was able to go out for at least 3 days. I didn't go out for even longer than that because I'm not used to driving on the ice. He grew up in the Northeast and has experience driving on the ice, but I don't, and so I would prefer not to risk it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't blame you. I also am not experienced in that.
Yeah.
So how long would you say your recovery process took for your tornado rebuilding? I know you said your damage was minor. But...
Well, our damage was minor. We had to have our roof replaced.
Okay.
And so, I think it took a month or two to get the roof replaced, but it wasn't anything that was a big deal because the roof wasn't leaking or anything. We just had to get a contractor to do it.
Good.
So, I mean, we were, Baruch Hashem, we were very, very blessed with the fact that we had no really big deal. It wasn't affecting our lives. It wasn't like we had holes in our roof or, parts of our house broken or anything like that. I mean, our damage was so minor compared to, like, my friend down the street whose whole house was completely damaged and who's still waiting to have a contractor rebuild her home.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think you know my friend Heidi, right?
I do.
Yeah,
Yes.
so Heidi is still waiting to have her home
Yeah.
rebuilt.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Gosh. Yeah. Almost
Yeah.
3 years later.
Yeah, I mean, she has no house, so.
Yeah. Do you know what some of the barriers to recovery have been for either in your own experience or with your neighbors of why the rebuilding is taking
Well,
as long as
with
it
her,
is?
it's an insurance issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the case with most people. It's an issue with the insurance companies not wanting to be, to settle appropriate claims. I think that's the biggest issue. With some, in the beginning, it was an issue of being able to get construction workers, but I think that's gone at this point.
Mm-hmm.
In the very beginning, it was an issue of being able to get construction workers, but not anymore.
Mm-hmm. Do you know if the construction workers were mostly local to Dallas or if there was a need?
They brought in workers from out of state.
Okay.
And that was good that they were available and able to come.
Mm-hmm.
And from a recovery standpoint, when there was, disaster relief workers came in from out of state, and I know that goes on, across the country. Certain churches send disaster relief workers,
Mm-hmm.
and that goes on all the time. You hear about that.
Mm-hmm. Do you know, or did you work directly with any of those relief organizations?
I did not personally, I worked with JFS, so,
Okay.
that's the organization that I worked with.
Mm-hmm. And I know the Federation also sustained some damage.
Yes, they did,
Can
and
you
they
talk
had to
to
close the
that?
building and redo it, and so all the Federation workers came over and worked in the JCC building,
Mm.
and then they had to rebuild the Federation building.
Do you know how long that took?
Oh, I think it took a couple years. It took a while.
Wow.
Yeah, it took a while to get the whole thing done. I'm not quite sure of all the timing, but
Mm-hmm.
it also took place at a time when they were reorganizing in terms of who was going to do what, when, and who, and how, and to whom, and how. So it all coincided with the reorganization. So I know that people who were working on the second floor of the JCC building wound up then going over and working the Federation building. So I didn't keep track of the whole timing of it, but it was all going on simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. Were some of those roles, how were the decisions made of who would make the decisions?
Well,
do you know?
The Federation board.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did the tornado impact the behaviors of the Federation or the JCC in the type of response or recovery that they were willing or able to make in future traumatic events to the community, like the pandemic, for instance?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about with your experience today?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, thank you. This was so helpful, and really appreciate learning your insight to some of the events that have happened in Dallas. And
You're
thank you
welcome.
so much for your time.